So congratulations, by now you've completed 9 of the 10 steps. You've become fluent in how to understand arguments, how to evaluate them in a fair, compelling, and substantial way, and how to construct arguments that have depth and have specific claims that provide evidence for important and compelling conclusions. Step 10 of this process is a particularly challenging one. It involves the recognition that argumentation is something that happens not between automatons, not between disembodied brains, but between real, living, breathing human beings. And in fact, it's that reality, it's the fact that when we contradict someone or disagree with someone, that can be so difficult for us to handle that we sometimes lose our critical thinking skills. In most critical thinking classes, this human aspect of argumentation is completely ignored. One is presented with material as if logic will always rule the day. Reason and rationality are the only hallmarks of an important and compelling argument, and the fact that actual people exchange them is relatively unimportant. Luckily, I had a colleague by the name of Martin Fowler who wrote a great book that for once recognized that because argument happens among and between human beings, it has ethical elements. It has ethical facets. It has ethical responsibilities to it. So just like in the last step when I recommended Anthony Weston's rulebook for arguments, I also recommend for this step Martin Fowler's Ethical Practice for Critical Thinkers. But if you haven't read that, I'm going to go through some of its main principles. Now, why will you need these? Because in order to complete step 10, you have a fairly daunting assignment in front of you. Just like with step 9, and it may in fact be a similar or the same topic that you worked on in step 9, you're going to need to isolate a topic, come up with a position, perhaps in a group, develop some arguments, and then invite someone who is not from your university community or your college community, but who has an investment in that same issue, but with a different perspective from yours. Invite them into your classroom and debate them. Disagree with them. Criticize their arguments and offer your arguments up for their critique. In many critical thinking classes, there is a debate assignment, but it's usually among the class itself, and this can be very valuable. You can learn a lot from debating with your peers. But in real life, we usually have in arguments some form of investment, and that gives arguments a different kind of emotional intensity. It's one thing to vilify people from the safe distance of a computer screen, and it's another thing to look across the table to a real live living person who just disagrees with you, and to be able to have a substantial and compelling discussion precisely about what you disagree with. Now, the point of this assignment, I call it a panel presentation, you may call it a debate, is not to come to agreement. It's not to come to consensus. It's not to find common ground, although all of those things may happen. The purpose of this assignment is to understand your perspective better, is to understand your guest's perspective better, and in fact, to make the understanding of anyone who witnesses that presentation deeper, more substantial, more robust. I want you and your guest and the people who witness this presentation to know more about the topic than when they went in. It may serve to clarify their perspective. It may serve to change it. It may serve nothing else than to confuse it. But their understanding of the topic should be deepened and should be enhanced. Now, when you talk about the ethics of argumentation, you have to ask about the purpose. And as I just said, I want to claim that the purpose of argumentation is to deepen understanding. If one is to deepen understanding, certain things, like name calling, misrepresenting your opponent's position, insulting the opponent's colleagues or family, these things will actually decrease our ability to understand a topic in depth. What Fowler's book has done is isolate 4 principles that, if they're recognized, if they're upheld, if they're maintained throughout a discussion, can serve to make sure the discussion remains substantial. Again, they do not serve to reduce or eliminate conflict. In fact, quite the opposite, because the very first principle that Fowler talks about is the principle of conflict. That is, in order to have what Fowler calls a sustaining argument. And what he means by that is an argument that sustains the interest in the topic, sustains the community within which it takes place, and the individuals who are partaking in it. We must not run away from conflict. We must be very clear about those places where we disagree. In fact, we probably need to orient ourselves towards the places where we disagree. We have to focus on differences in order for the argument to have some traction, to have some meaning, in order for it to be worthwhile. So, the principle of conflict would be violated if you, for example, conceded a point that you really weren't convinced of, or if you refrained from contradicting a clearly inaccurate claim in the midst of the argument. So, principle of conflict, which should keep us from trying to get to common ground at all costs. Second principle, the principle of scholarship. Fowler writes, one should respect one's topic enough not to go mouthing off, frankly, about something you don't know. In other words, come prepared. If you're going to have an argument with someone, you should know your stuff. You should do your homework. Your position should be well grounded in the scholarship that has been done on it. Of course, reading scholarship demands that you think critically about its sources, about when it was produced, under what conditions it was produced. And given the amount of scholarship that's out there on so many topics, you may not be able to master the entire amount that's out there. But you need to recognize that a good argument is not done in the absence of good information and analysis, but takes scholarship as an important resource in order to develop a very, very strong argument. Okay, the principle of charity. This principle involves not willfully misrepresenting your opponent's views and taking, if there's any question about your opponent's claims, about their assertions, about the kind of arguments, essentially giving them the benefit of the doubt. So, there may be certain claims that your opponent is a little vague on. You could ask for clarity on that. But if you have a question between two possible meanings of a way that a statement could be interpreted, one of which would be really easy to disagree with, really easy to refute, the other one, which would be a little more challenging, the principle of charity says, give your opponent the benefit of the doubt and respond to the more challenging claim. Certainly, above all, do not misrepresent your opponent's views. This happens all the time in our political discourse. People make claims about other people's positions, about the beliefs that they hold that are so laughably extreme that they're clearly inaccurate and false. And Fowler would say that's a violation of the principle of charity. Finally, the principle of substance. That is, don't argue just for the fun of it. Don't argue just for the sport of it. That turns argumentation into a kind of parlor game full of tricks that you may or may not be well versed in. The principle of substance says don't enter into an argument unless it has some meaning for you, unless it matters, unless there's some skin in the game in terms of how it turns out. Now, I will admit that philosophers themselves do not always uphold all of these principles, and certainly not always the principle of substance. But if you want to have arguments that are sustaining, if you want to have arguments that are productive, both in terms of the relationship of the people who are having them and in terms of your own understanding, it cannot be just for fun. There has to be some investment. There has to be some larger meaning behind them that really calls upon us to do our best thinking. And when we have that investment in the topic, then in fact, the person we're arguing against, who may make some excellent critiques of ours, is not so much an opponent, but their good critique of our arguments helps us to develop our position even further, to gain deeper and more enhanced wisdom about what we hold to be true and what others hold to be true. Ethics as argumentation does not avoid conflict, but it also rejects the us versus them, the opponent kind of model that says who won that debate and who lost. Real critical thinkers aren't interested in winning or losing. Real critical thinkers are hungry for knowledge and wisdom and understanding. And someone who can really challenge you on even some of your most heartfelt and fundamental beliefs is certainly within your corner. It's certainly on your side. It's certainly, in fact, one of the most important allies you can have if your goal is to deepen your own wisdom and your own understanding and your own flexibility. Sustaining arguments don't involve victories. Sustaining arguments don't involve crushing your opponent into a bloody pulp. They involve deepening understanding. And as such, they can be far more collegial, even while upholding Fowler's principle of conflict. Now, this is an intimidating assignment, there's no doubt about it. Again, as I said, it's one thing to criticize a person through a screen or writing on a paper, and it's another thing to look them in the eye and say, I just think that isn't convincing. But you'll learn a lot from it, and believe it or not, the people that you invite in will learn a lot too.